Awesome. So I am an artist. I really can't stand telling people that when I first meet them. It just has lost its meaning to me over the last several years. I'm an artist. And people don't necessarily take it seriously. Most people think it means I don't have a job. What's interesting is what is art? There's so many different forms of art today. There's so many different forms of creativity and expression. It's kind of convoluted. But for me, art has been painting, photography, and filmmaking. And all these are different expressions of light. So I look at painting as an artist's interpretation of the world. It's an interpretation of light that ends up on a canvas, on a piece of paper, or on a wall. And then photography is a representation of light. Light passes through a lens to a film plane, whether that be film, or whether that be Polaroid, or the sensors on your cell phones. And then film is light in motion. So my path in following light started when I was very, very young. I remember I was in second grade when I first started learning about painting. And I started learning about photography. And I started learning about imagery. And I remember I was sitting in this second grade art class, and everyone in the room that day was asked to draw these ducks. So we sat there and scribbled. We're little kids. It wasn't that big of a deal. But when the teacher got around to mine, my ducks actually looked like ducks at a very young age. And I remember I was never the smartest in the classroom or the fastest on the field. But when I brought these ducks home, my parents were super proud. They framed them. They're still on their wall. And my friends were impressed. And at a very young age, I found my identity. I became the kid who can paint, who can draw. And I held on to that identity. Growing up's tough, but if you start to find out who you are early on, it can make it a little easier, and it did for me. So years later, I'm in another art class. It's high school at this point. And the kids in the room are pretty talented. We're a little older. And we were supposed to paint a portrait of a man. And the teacher at the end of the day walked around to everyone's portrait and said, great job, great job. And then they got to mine. I said, Patrick, what is this? This looks nothing like the man. And I said, well, it does to me. And I saw life, I saw motion, I saw color differently, and I realized at that moment that people can see things differently, and it's not a bad thing. Even though I failed that assignment, I still saw the world different than the people sitting around me. So I went, not too much longer after that, I was in this English class, and they gave us a book. It was called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And I remember it was so thin that I thought to myself, I'm actually going to read this book. This might be the only book I read while I'm in school. It was like 95 pages. And I did. I blistered through it. I loved every single moment of that book. I really, truly did. And I showed up to class like 3 days later to take the test, and I thought, I'm ready for this. And he said, we're not going to take a test. We're going to watch a movie. And I was like, no, I'm going to get an A. The first A I may ever have and the only A. Let's take the test. And so anyway, he starts the movie. And halfway through, I realized that it was the same story as Heart of Darkness, told through a different lens, told by someone who saw the light a little differently than Joseph Conrad. That was Francis Ford Coppola, and that movie's called Apocalypse Now. Probably one of the finest pieces of cinema that's ever been created. But it inspired me so greatly that I went home and I bought my first camera. And I started shooting with my friends. Anything that I possibly could. Every single day after school, I was shooting films. And I learned how to edit. I taught myself. I was watching movies, going to theaters, watching classics. I was absorbing everything I could because I became obsessed. And at 16 years old, I realized this is what I was going to do with the rest of my life, furthering that identity. So this led me to film school, where I learned film history, film theory. I learned how to screenwrite. I became obsessed with screenwriting. I love that part of filmmaking. It's where it all begins. And I just fell in love with it. So I went to New York, and I learned how to shoot on film, 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter. I love film because it's what I grew up with. Everything's digital now, a lot of things. But I love film. You get a grain, you get a texture that you're just not going to get digitally. So at this time, I'm still painting all the time. This is just a part of my life. I was selling my art. That's how I was surviving. I was still learning how to take photographs, better photographs, understanding both those crafts. But when I came home from New York, I realized it was time, well, I thought it was time, to make my first feature film, which was called The Carolinian. And it was, I just wanted it to be so big. I didn't want to make this small film. I figured it was time to be bold. So I wanted to make this period history drama piece. It was crazy. We had no money, we had no resources, but we built all the sets and we made all the costumes, and we just put in so much passion and energy to this movie, and we thought it was going to be really big, and it was exciting. I learned a lot. I'm not saying that it wasn't great, but when we all sat in the theater to watch this movie at the Rialto for our premiere, I realized halfway through this film that it was really, really bad. Like, really bad. And it wasn't a bad experience, like I was saying. It wasn't. I learned that I wanted to be a director. I learned that I liked working with actors. And I learned that I wanted to keep going. It was just the beginning of the journey. This was our first one, but we did something that was nearly impossible. Pulling off a film at that age was, looking back, I would never do it again. I wouldn't suggest it. It almost, it was tough. That's all I can say. So, after the film, I'm still painting. I'm still selling my work. I became I was in Raleigh at a unique time where I became a very small whisper of a very loud voice that helped revitalize a city. There was artists, musicians, chefs, architects, all these interesting people, entrepreneurs, technology entrepreneurs that were moving the city forward, and we all lived here when Raleigh didn't look exactly like it looks today. This wasn't that long ago. But I was, living in my art studio at the time. It was this warehouse called Ruby Red with other artists and musicians. A very special time in my life. It was the real struggle that I had heard about growing up that I had romanticized. And there I was, living in my studio. So one day I walked across the street to another art studio. And I walked in, and on the wall were these giant paintings with crazy price tags. Crazy price tags. And I didn't get it, because to me, they just looked like scribbles. I didn't understand at all how this artist was selling this work for this price. And the guy walks up to me, his name's Jason Craig, and he said, "Hey, aren't you Patrick Shanahan? Aren't you the guy who makes films?" And in my head, I was thinking, no, I'm actually the kid that paints. Sorry. But he's like, "I want to do a documentary. And I want to do it about my art, my philosophy, and what I do." And I said, "Well, I'm not a documentary filmmaker, but I was interested to learn more about these scribbles." So I said yes. And during that time, I learned so much about Jason. I learned about myself. I learned how to use a camera better. I learned how to work on the fly, find the moments, live in the moment, and bring that to the screen, and how to tell a story on the back end as opposed to screenwriting. And I really, really enjoyed that process of understanding documentary film. But what I really learned from Jason, more importantly than anything, was that these were not scribbles at all. These were moments of a human being's soul that ended up on a canvas. I know that sounds idealistic, but when you spend time with an artist that is completely into his craft and in tune with what he's doing, because I can't paint like this. I can't. I've never seen anyone else that can. But he's had such success because he has such conviction and passion and honor in what he's doing. And every little painting that he does is telling a greater story of who he is and what he believes and the love that he believes in that exists in the world and is trying to spread. So I took the idea that I learned from Jason, that the message is important, that every artist, every storyteller, every creator should have a message. And everything that I had been doing at this point was pretty pictures, fun films, silly photographs, whatever. It didn't really have a message. So I decided to make another feature film, and it was called Empirica. This one was bigger. We bought a 1957 Chevy Bel Air that barely ran, and we took that thing from Raleigh, North Carolina, all the way to San Diego, California. I would love to tell you guys the story of what happened on that film, but we would be here all night. It was way more intense than the Carolinian. I mean, really tough times. We shot it on film. There were 6 of us in the crew and a huge cast, and it was just an unbelievable experience that shaped my entire life. And I wish I could tell you that story, but it's not necessarily about that. The most important thing that happened on this film was when we found ourselves back in the Rialto. I was standing at the back of the theater, and we were watching this film. And it was better. It wasn't that bad. Not great, but it wasn't that bad. It wasn't as bad as Carolinian. And I remember when the first joke landed, I heard the audience laugh. And I was like, oh man, that's so freaking cool. Like, I wrote that, and they're laughing. That's wild. This is nuts. And then at the end of the film, this is a spoiler, when the main character dies, people cried, and they were moved. And even me in the back of the audience by myself, looking at a packed audience, I was in tears. Not because the main character had died, because I knew that was going to happen. I wrote that. But I was in tears because it had been such a struggle. Many, many, many hours that I couldn't even explain how many thousands of hours go into filmmaking. And in drawing a parallel to painting, it's just me and a canvas and a brush. The mistakes are mine. The ones that are made are mine. And the good parts are mine. That's all me. But with a film, there's so many moving pieces and moving parts that you share your troubles and you share your glory. It's very, very, very tough to make film. And at the end, when I realized that something we had done together had an impact on the audience, it furthered my idea that I had learned from Jason, which was we have a responsibility in the messages that we tell people and the way that we move each other to remind each other that we're connected, that we're alive, and that we're in this together, that we're not so different, we're not so separate. And that's why this film was extremely important to me in my development as an artist. So, I'm still painting all the time. And I took these ideas and this idea of message, and I started painting even more. I started incorporating multiple figures into my work. I started understanding color and light and shadow better. I started working on my portraiture to see if I could get closer to what a man looked like. And I started incorporating other materials like paper, charcoal. I started doing this drip technique that I've really fallen in love with. It's more impressionistic than anything I had done before. I started taking more photographs and understanding how a figure fits into space and the spatial relativity that exists there. And I started incorporating my painting into photography, mixing medias, trying to understand it all better. And then I finally arrived at what I feel still today is my painting style. It's figural, there's text, there's my drip texture, everything that I wanted. It's very Americana, and it all calls back to the Native Americans and the pioneers in a very interesting time that I feel like we're somehow mirroring right now with troubles we're having and just how we pioneer forward as Americans and as a collected culture. And I was so proud. This is the top of my career. I was selling work left and right. I was having shows left and right. Everything was great. But at this time, I was in a new art studio with Jason Craighead, the scribbler, and some really talented artists. I mean, I was so humbled and just really fortunate to be on a hall with these men and women that were really talented. I was the young gun, and I don't think I belonged there. These people are really talented artists. And I remember coming in one night really late. We were always there late. It's called Switch House. And Jason was painting, scribbling away. And I walked in, I said, Jason, I need some help. I need some guidance. I really respect you. How do I get to the next level? How do I get to New York? How do I get to LA? How do I get to Miami? I want to be in galleries. I want to be in museums. I want to take that next step. And so Jason sat me down. He looked me in the eye, as he always does, which I really, really respect about that man. These sincere moments that you share with people are so important. And he said, I think you're a decent painter, Patrick. I think you're a decent photographer. I think you're a decent filmmaker. But imagine what would happen if you let the other pieces fall away and you focused on one creative outlet. I didn't really know what he was talking about. And then he said, I think you could be a great filmmaker if you let the other pieces fall away. So initially I was shocked, and I thought, well, yeah, I can put down a camera. That's not that big of a deal, but I can't imagine giving up painting. It still trips me out when I think about this moment in my life. I can't imagine it because that's my passion, that's my soul, that's everything that I had. That was my identity. I'm the kid who paints, and now you're telling me to give that up and walk away from it. And I remember leaving pretty disappointed that night. And I didn't go back to the studio for a few weeks, but when I did return, there was a letter. And the letter was from the state of North Carolina saying that we were going to lose our studio, that the railroad was coming through. We literally got railroaded. And I had a choice to make. Do I find a new studio? Do I start one of my own? Or do I pack up the brushes, the paint, and the canvases and put them into storage? And I did the latter. And they're still in the storage unit. Because I started focusing on filmmaking, on screenwriting particularly. And I spent a lot of time on this script. And it wasn't some grandiose film where we were burning down buildings with guns blaring, and it wasn't this crazy road trip film. It was simple. I shot it here in Raleigh, a little bit in Wilmington, but I shot it mostly here in my hometown of Raleigh. I wanted it to be that way, and we hired real producers, and we cast real actors from the Screen Actors Guild, true professionals, people that understood the craft as well as I was trying to, people that I was able to learn from. And the people that I worked with on this film was called The Fox Hunter, were so supportive, and this is really what all of this had led up to was The Fox Hunter. Because I took what I had learned through interpreting light onto a canvas, and I took what I learned through representing light through photography, and I put it into motion on screen in a different way that I had never really been capable of doing before. And when I looked at the images that we were getting from this film, I was so pleased, but it had really nothing to do with me necessarily as it was the we that was involved. And every day when I showed up as the director, and the first day I remember someone walked up to me and was like, hey, boss. I was like, whoa. Do not call me that again, but it was cool when it happened. Let's just move on. I'm no one's boss. We're all here to make this together. But being there with the true cinematographer and having my AD at my back, I was nervous as hell that first day. I can't explain the nerves before I walked out. And as soon as I looked at that screen and I saw that everyone was there for something I had spent hundreds, thousands of hours working on before they ever got there, I knew that they had all had their own path and their own journey, because what's interesting and took me time to figure out is that all of us are storytellers. We all tell stories to each other. It's not just storyteller audience or painter audience, filmmaker audience. We all tell stories to each other at home with the people we love, our friends. And I think that's really important to understand, that all these people were different storytellers, and we all found ourselves together in the same place after our own personal journeys. And I remember I was standing there on the last day, surrounded by my actors, most talented people I've ever met in my life, and we had sweat and bled together for 14 hours a day, 6 days in a row, 6-day weeks, for a month. And I came to know these people as family. And you get really close with people when you're going through those emotional states, because when you're sitting there with an actor you're just feet away from these people that are either crying or laughing and having a moment that you wrote on a piece of paper, is a very transformative experience to see it done right. And after doing it bad and doing it okay, we'd finally done it right. And I remember thinking that these people would be my friends forever, and we are. We still work together today. And there's this parallel thing that happens between what happens behind the camera and what happens on camera. But there's a real similarity to it, because it's what you take away from it. I learned as much as I did about making film and about myself when I was making that film as I did when I watched the film, and realized that there were so many pieces of my soul in there. And that I had come from just being this kid that paints to understanding how to get those paintings and those ideas through a message onto the screen and paint with light. And I think that, looking back, the most important thing that I've learned through this experience is that it's not just that we tell stories to each other. There's a really important story, and that's the one that we tell ourselves. And I was telling myself a story of a kid that could do anything. I wanted to do it all. And I've done a lot. I have. I've been very fortunate to have this position that people believed in me and supported me. But we all tell stories to ourselves, and I think that if we could just focus a little bit and maybe let some of the distractions fall away, or we can find that moment, our own light, and everyone's individual light, because it's not that because I was a painter that I was special, or I was different or unique, which I thought for so long. I was different and no one saw the world like me. What makes us special as human beings is that we all see the world differently. And that's pretty spectacular. So maybe if we're more honest in the stories that we tell ourselves, then more of us will be able to find our light.